Well, good morning. Hello, everybody. This is uh, a new entry into my catalog of videos. I'm beginning to start my Saturday morning. I'm a cat in my lap. I'm beginning to start my Saturday morning today with some thoughts, and they're interesting thoughts, but I don't want to deal with them today. So I thought what I'd do is just dump my thoughts before walking out the door and getting on with my day, and so that way I can focus on other things. And what right now in the situation, I'm in hand-to-hand combat with the AFCC and the forensic psychologists there, and um, I submitted an article. Okay, I've written an article that describes the pathology and submitted. I'm going to be submitting it to journals, and I submitted it to the AFCC journal first. And I got notice yesterday that the article had been declined by their journal, Family Court Review. And I'm thinking of my response. I'm going to respond today with the Grok AI review of my work. But then I thought, I do that, but I also thought that I can actually get Maggie. We're working on all sorts of AI projects. I can get her to run the article through AI, and so I can do an AI review of the article and then review the reviewer's review, and it begins to extrapolate out. What the AFCC didn't understand, what the editorial board didn't understand, is that I wasn't submitting for publication in Family Court Review. I was submitting to be rejected by Family Court Review. And so it was a stimulus in to get their rejection. And so now I've got that there's conflict of interest, there's all sorts of problems with the editorial board of the AFCC. Now, I admit I put a poison pill in there that they wouldn't like, but it's clinical psychology, it's diagnosis and treatment, and so now I'm going to submit the article down to other journals. I could just post it online and start using it as evidence of problems, but I'm going to take my time, run it through AI, might do a journal article. But that's the other thing. I'm going to start writing these journal articles, little focus journal articles, and submitting them to the AFCC. And they'll have to say no, 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 repeatedly. And I'm just going to be documenting things like risk assessment, that we have three obligations: to conduct a proper risk assessment, make sure one gets conducted, to take an affirmative protective action, and to document that action in the patient's medical record. Relative to forensic custody evaluations, they need to do that. If there's possible child abuse, psychological child abuse is always a considered diagnosis when a child's rejecting a parent. So I'll submit that. They'll have to say no. I'll submit another one. They'll have to say no. The other feature about this, though, is I'm going to be encountering the forensic psychologist. Today's task is I have to write a course review or a conference review. Those evaluations at the end of a conference, two presenters presented at the conference of the Washington chapter of the AFCC. So I got these two presenters, and now I have to complete the evaluation form to get my CE credits. They're asking me questions and say, what do you think of the knowledge of the instructors? Well, you ask, so I'm going to tell you. And so I've wanted some clear time to be able to focus in, and did that. I did it once, and then I had to reboot my computer, so I lost the first time through. But I have a question on that, which is how direct to be. Okay, but there's no sugarcoating the evaluation. Okay, I'm Professor Childress. Okay, I've taught courses. I know grading, and I give this an F. Okay, and I don't think the students studied or read any of the material, which is the other thing I'm going to work on today is the course curriculum. But and so I'm going to be direct, which is going to do, but then also I have 1.04 and 1.05 responsibilities. the AP Ethics Code to me. And so I'll be encountering them more and more. Uh, the um, the other idea moving through, I've had a lot of ideas about that today. I'm kind of, oh, well, that's just so interesting. Like running the article now that they rejected, running it through Grok AI and or some of the AIs and see how they review it, and then doing an article on journal review by AI versus independent reviewer or biased reviewers who have personal gain to get by maintaining the status quo. And so it'll be an interesting article. Okay, and I'll submit that to the AFCC first, and they'll have to reject it, and then we'll go to another journal. Okay, and we'll keep doing that. And I'm working on another separate journal article that's headed over to the ethics journals. Okay, so I'm going to be hitting the ethics journals. I'm thinking I might submit this current one, just do a light revision of it and submit it to a clinical journal. Okay, about what's going on in the family courts, and we need the return of clinical psychology. And I might submit it to a couple of clinical journals and see what they say. One is I can simply document that they are ignoring the family court issues. Okay, so I'll submit to a couple of APA journals on clinical, and then get a rejection and say, okay, there's my documentation that the clinical psychology is ignoring the family courts. Meanwhile, the one I'm driving through is the experiment on human subjects. Okay, that they left the healthcare system, got into the judicial system, and were allowed to do an experiment on human subjects without proper oversight. And that's opened this new ethics line on standard 3.04, avoiding harm. And I've always had avoiding harm sitting there, but I've been leading with standard of 2.01 competence and 2.04 applied knowledge. That's easy to document. And then the violation of 2.04 and 2.01 leads to the violation of 9.01. Their opinions are not based on information and techniques sufficient to substantiate their findings. So I got that triad that I've been moving forward, but I've always had 3.04, avoiding harm, underneath. And that becomes relevant on the experiment. They conducted an experiment on human subjects. They left healthcare, moved over to quasi-judicial role for doctors. There's never been that. There's never been custody evaluations before 1980 because we didn't have divorces before 1980. We didn't have this issue before, 1940s and 30s of divorcing families who's going to get custody. Starting in the 60s, 70s, 80s, divorces started to happen. We started having custody conflicts. And so off they went to their experiment on human subjects. They believed that the court would benefit from their expertise in a quasi-judicial role but they weren't going to diagnose and treat pathology. Okay, that's not their role. And they say that all over the place. They say we're doing something different. We're doing this quasi-judicial role. That's an experimental role for doctors. Then they came up with this custody evaluation, which is an experimental assessment procedure for their new experimental role. It doesn't diagnose, it doesn't treat, it doesn't do history and symptoms, it doesn't do so much. It doesn't answer a referral question. It does so much. It is problematic about that assessment approach. It's an experiment for the experimental role. And they were allowed to conduct an experiment on human subjects, not simply human subjects, a vulnerable population because of their impaired autonomy. And they got into the family courts and exploited that impaired autonomy to experiment on them because they thought they had some better idea than diagnosis and treatment. Well, guess what? Their experiment failed. There was no risk-benefit analysis for it. There was no oversight. There was no approval because it wasn't conducted within the healthcare system. It was conducted over in the legal system. And that's where they exploited the impaired autonomy. And they only gave the legal system and these parents one choice, their custody evaluation approach. They withheld clinical diagnostic assessments, and no clinical psychologists work in the family courts because we gave that over to the forensic people. They had a perfect situation, perfect storm to exploit these parents. And so where 3.04 becomes active is it says, the doctors or psychologists take reasonable steps to avoid harming their patients. Now, for a doctor, making a professional level diagnosis, DSM-5 diagnosis, represents a reasonable step to take to avoid the potential harm of misdiagnosis if you don't make a professional level diagnosis. If you don't make a diagnosis, if you just say, we don't diagnose and we're just going to talk about the situation, you run the risk of misdiagnosing something. And then you come back and say, we think it's a, well, did you assess for possible persecutory delusion? Talk about it. Tell us why you're ruling that out. Factitious disorder imposed on another. Either one or both is going to be child psychological abuse. And one of the litigant parents really wants to know this information, okay? And you're not providing it. Now, that litigant parent and their attorney bring me into a matter as their psychological consultant. I'm going to want to know what the diagnosis is at a professional level from you, from the involved professional. Tell me what and you say, I'm not going to tell you because that's not what I do. That is a risky thing to do when you're working with delusional thought disorders and a very manipulative personality. Narcissistic, dark, borderline personalities, very manipulative. And if you're not applying the diagnostic criteria, you run a considerable risk of misdiagnosis, especially when you're not competent in delusional thought disorders 2.01. And so that's a reasonable step to take, but they don't diagnose. So therefore, they're in violation of 3.04, avoiding harm, because they're not identifying what the problem is. And they're just making recommendations in situations with their experimental new approach. Now, the additional information that came this morning that kind of said, I'm going to sit down and download all of this so I don't carry it into my future work. And I'm trying to think about, developing PowerPoints for curriculum. Meantime, I'm off on some other tangent thinking-wise. There's two parts to 3.04. The first part is that, okay, you take reasonable steps to avoid harming your patients, and they're vulnerable they don't make a diagnosis, and that would be a reasonable step for a doctor to take to avoid the harm of misdiagnosis. Now, but there's a second part having to do with terrorists, and that was enhanced interrogation. And so the second part says when psychologists are not allowed to participate in any way, consultation, nothing, with enhanced interrogation techniques. Okay. And now I kind of know that's relevant, and I have an interest in terrorists and stuff. And so I'm aware of some of the depth to that piece of the standard. But I haven't thought about applying it to the family courts because I got so much other stuff. 2.01, 2.04, 9.01, then 3.04 becomes active. There's an experiment, and all that is going to take precedence moving forward. But that terrorist clause, 3.04b, it applies because we have the vulnerable population. We have I got this quote from Stahl and Simon Stahl, their book, that says that the forensic psychologists are an agent of the state, and their goal is not to relieve people's suffering and discomfort. Okay. And that's a problematic thing for doctors to do, to be an agent of the state participating in something that's designed to not relieve suffering of the patient. Okay. And so I would offer that they're not in violation of 3.04b, because that specifically has to do with enhanced interrogation, and that's not what we're doing. But it's in the scope of participating or in stuff with a vulnerable population that's problematic. When we go into a vulnerable population like what's in the family courts, doctors, psychologists should always be concerned about protecting the child's well-being, diagnosis and treatment, and protecting kids from child abuse. We shouldn't be going in as agents of the state to do something else that does not involve resolving the child's suffering or the parent's suffering in that situation. We're doctors, when we're psychologists, when we go into a situation, it's always our task to resolve the suffering in that situation. And if we're stepping outside that role with an enhanced interrogation or with custody evaluations for the court as a state involved, that's a bad role to be in. And so that was the completion of my 3.04 kind of stuff. I said, yeah, that agents of the state is a problem. But ultimately, and it goes back to everything else I'm doing in countering the AFCC, ultimately, I'm going to be discussing with the attorneys within the AFCC that we have two litigant parents. Okay, what the AFCC needs to understand is I represent one of the litigant parents and their attorney. That attorney is bringing me in to be part of that legal psychological team for one of your litigant parents. And so you need to kind of listen to what the arguments of one of your litigant parents is. And so that's when they say, no, we don't want to publish this article. Well, you're suppressing information directly relevant to one of the litigant parents. So I'll get this information out there elsewhere, but I just want you to know, AFCC, that you are intentionally biasing the judgment in favor of the pathological parent against the targeted parent by withholding information from your psychologists and from the general public relevant to the arguments of the targeted parent. Okay, now why did you do that? I have a little bit of your analysis. I haven't read it yet, but I got it now. Okay, good. And then I've got, maybe I'll run it through my article through AI, but I've also got just my whole work. I'm going to send them the Grok response to my AI stuff. Thank you, Angela. And we'll see what happens. Okay, with the attorneys, with the judges, with everybody there. I'm going to be challenging the validity of their reliance on this set of psychologists for their information. I'm going to say you're getting biased, self-serving information from this group, and that you potentially need to broaden your understanding of the pathology and the issues as legal professionals, because you're going to be grappling with the challenges to the psychological information that's being introduced by these custody evaluators. This Sunday, that's the other thing I'm going to work on today, is putting together the PowerPoint for a VITA review of Leslie Droyd. She's a forensic psychologist in Newport Beach. Long VITA, been here, since 1980s. And she was one of the presenters of the 8-module course, 4-day course of the AFCC that I've been notifying people about, and did a slide-by-slide review and catalog of concerns. And then she was also one of the two presenters at the Washington chapter conference that I attended. And so that was what I'm reviewing, is Leslie Droyd again. And I've looked at her VITA. That's what I'm going to do, is I'm going to do a VITA review based around 2.01 competence. Now, I need to be careful. Okay, I'm not going to push the boundaries at this point in time. I'm going to just be laying out what it is. Let's take a look at her VITA. And this is one of the top forensic psychologists that you're relying on for your opinions and presenting to the other psychologists as an expert and as an educator, or talking about the pathology. And I can do the same thing with other top psychologists. I'm thinking Sullivan would be right up top. Saini, he's the president of the AFCC. So I've got his VITA kind of worked up. He's got a bachelor's in sociology, a master's in social work, and a doctorate in social work. He doesn't have any clinical psychology training or educational experience, and he's only worked in the family courts. And so his breadth of knowledge in psychology over with delusional thought disorders or attachment pathology is limited. Okay, and you just look at his VITA and then you say, does he meet the requirements for competence with attachment pathology, delusional thought disorders, family systems pathology, when he has a doctorate in social work? And I don't see any other areas where he acquired that knowledge in attachment and family systems and delusional thought disorders. So I don't know. He can talk about it. Final piece I'm going to be presenting to the AFCC is we need to debate these. I'm willing to debate any of these issues. Is a forensic psychology an experiment on human subjects in the family courts? Yes, Dr. Childress. Pick a forensic psychologist to say no. AFCC hosts a 2-hour online mediated debate. I'm in. Okay. Moderated debate. Okay. So nice peaceful thing. I'll just present the evidence and they can respond to the evidence and we can make our judgments. Okay. Are the forensic psychologists competent in the necessary domains of knowledge? Are they in violation of ethical standards for competence? Yes, Dr. Childress. No, forensic psychologists. Pick one, and so I've got any one of these topic areas of my challenge. I'm willing to debate any one of them. Okay, so that's going to be an interesting position for the AFCC. Now, with that, I'm going to jump off and to my Saturday, run get a cup of coffee, start my PowerPoint. I want to start in with the curriculum because that's got me most excited. And I'm going to do the syllabus on Sunday. So I'm going to I'm going to start with the reading list, sort of. So syllabus, what's the reading list? I'm not going to necessarily tie it to the weeks of the course yet. But that's what I'm going to be working out kind of today. Is what's the syllabus? What am I going to cover? Session 1, session 2, session 3. So I might provide chapter, references. So the reading list is Bowlby, 3 parts, and I don't know. I'll come up with it this afternoon. Oh, Tronic and Gold. And so the first course is going to be heavily focused on attachment, then the personality disorder stuff for the last couple of weeks. But that's going to be a lot of articles about dark personalities and Beck's book, Cognitive Therapy with Personality Disorders. But just Beck's book, because it's relatively cheap, it's paperback, but it's just the chapters on narcissistic and borderline personality pathology from Beck, not the other. So that lowers the reading demand, and then some articles on the dark lowers the reading demand. So, but basically the books, though, is walking through the 3 volumes of attachment applied to the family courts. What are the implications of what Bowlby's talking about applied to the family courts? And then also Tronic and Gold about breach and repair and the still face studies and the movement since Bowlby to the current state of our attachment knowledge. Then the second course in that is going to be focused on family systems. And I'm going to use, where is it? Well, yeah. There we go. I'm back again. I was looking around for my book and got hungry. But Family Evaluations by Murray Bowen and Kerr. And you think of a book written by one of the top family systems therapists, Murray Bowen, called Family Evaluation. You think that would be relevant to doing family evaluations for the family courts? Absolutely. So that's going to be the prime curriculum for part 2, or the second course, as well as Mnuchin's family systems therapy. So we'll learn family systems therapy, structural family systems, apply it to the family, inverted hierarchy, all those sorts of things. We'll apply triangulations and transgenerational transmissions from Bowen, and then I'll add a Madonna's to that as well. For the strategic family systems, talk about the contingent visitation schedule, application from a strategic family systems perspective. That's going to be the second course. So if you take the first course, and you'll learn all about the attachment. You take the second course, you'll learn all about the family systems applied, and you'll be knowledgeable. You'll know a lot about the pathology and the family course. Then I want to do a third course having to do with deep dive into the attachment system with this pathology. Do I have that book? Yeah, I do. Here it is. And that would be there we go. Back. All of a sudden, my screen popped up a lot of stuff again. Sorry. Saturday morning, gremlins trying to get me. Go away. You got work to do. You got work to do. You need to go away. Stop talking to these people. All right. But the deep dive course would be this would be one of the curriculum books, The Interpersonal World of the Infant. We'd look at the attachment system in the first year. Okay, what it is. Okay, what's going on? And that's the basic structures of our brain. Okay, of the love and bonding system. And it's built around the narrative structure with little stories called representations of interactions that become generalized. RIGS, and it's about 3 to 6 months, during the core self-development. So that would be fun. So I'm excited about doing the course stuff, and I get to do that today as soon as I stop talking to you. So with the urging of the gremlins, I'm going to head off to my day here today, and just wanted to clear all those thoughts off my head. So take care, everybody.